The history of the ancient kingdom of Rome as we know it today is steeped in myth and legend. The tale of the Seven Kings begins with the founding of the city and ends with the dawn of the Republic. Aside from being fascinating in and of itself, the story is also very important for the study of early Rome. This is because despite its obvious mythological elements, it is loosely based on real events. In order to truly understand the history of the Roman kingdom, we must examine two different sources: the Roman literary works and the archaeological findings. One of the biggest problems that one finds when studying the early period of Rome is the absence of contemporary literary sources. In fact, it was during the 3rd century BC, hundreds of years after the regal period, that the Romans, influenced by Greek historiography, started documenting their past. Writing initially in Greek and later in Latin, a number of Roman scholars went through a laborious research and produced remarkable works. There were two different types of scholars: the historians or annalists and the antiquarians, who we will talk about later in the video. The work of the historians was in the form of a narrative, a story of connected events, which oftentimes included the commentary of the writer himself. The first Roman scholar to write about the regal period was the senator Quintus Fabius Pictor. His work was an account of the history of Rome from the foundation of the city until the First Punic War, and it was written in Greek. Unfortunately, none of it survives today, but his work is quoted in many later historians' works. Another lost work, but mentioned in later writings, is the Origins, written by Cato the Elder. Cato was a Roman senator and was the first scholar to write history books in Latin. His work covers approximately the same period as that of Fabius, but Cato also includes the origins of other Italian cities. Arguably, the most important scholar who wrote about the early kingdom was Titus Livius, or Livy. Livy was a Roman historian from the city of Patavium in modern-day Padua. He was a close friend of the Emperor Augustus and a teacher to Augustus' grandnephew and future Emperor Claudius. His monumental work consisted of 142 books which covered the entire history of Rome from its foundation up until the reign of Augustus. Of the 142 books, only 35 survive in full form, including the first one, which tells the story of the origins of Rome and the period of the kings. Livy was the only Roman historian who was not a politician, although his work did include some political commentary, as he made frequent remarks about the moral decline of contemporary Rome compared to the past. However, his commentation is not nearly as invasive as that of other Roman historians. His style of narration was quite unique to the Romans at that time, as he focused on the character of the historical figures. This made his work much more enjoyable compared to other annalistic accounts, which were usually much more blunt. Though whether he made up the personalities of historical figures himself or studied them from his sources is unknown. Another renowned scholar was Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Dionysius was a Greek historian and rhetorician and a contemporary of Livy. In order to study the history of the city, he moved to Rome and learned Latin. His work, Roman Antiquities, consisted of 20 books, of which the first 11 survive. The first 4 books covered the prehistory of Rome and the period of the kings. Aside from the first book, in which Dionysius made different claims about the origins of Rome, the rest of the story is quite similar to that of Livy's. The only important difference between the two scholars was in their approach of the story and their commentary, as Dionysius was known to add lots of his own comments. Plutarch, a Greek philosopher and historian, was also very high esteemed. His work, Parallel Lives, was a series of biographies and provided an important source about early Rome, as it includes the biographies of Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. The last important scholar who wrote about early Rome was Strabo, a Greek geographer and historian. His monumental work, Geographica, was about the history and geography of the known world and consisted of 17 books. The 5th book covered the geography and early history of Rome and its neighboring cities. There were many other scholars who wrote about Rome's early history, but we mentioned those who were, and still are, the most important. It must be noted that there was never a single official story about the founding of Rome and its kingdom. In fact, there were various different versions, and the scholars continuously contradicted each other, especially when it came to chronology. Even the date of the city's foundation was debated. While the most accepted year was 753 BC, many Roman scholars dated the founding of the city hundreds of years earlier or later. Having said that, it is important to discuss about the sources the aforementioned scholars used. Many Roman scholars, especially the earliest ones, studied the works of Greek historians who had written about Rome before the Romans themselves were occupied with historiography. In these works, Rome was mostly mentioned briefly, but there were instances where precious pieces of information were provided about the city. The early Greek historians would either write about Rome's origins and remote past, mixing Greek mythology with local Italian legends, or about major contemporary events such as the sack of Rome by the Gauls or the defeat of Pyrrhus by the Romans. Another source, and probably the most important for the Roman historians, was the oral tradition, which included the stories passed down from generation to generation, or the songs that were performed at banquets and had to do with important events of early Roman history. Despite the fact that the stories of the oral tradition were mixed with legend, many of them were based on real events, to the surprise of many modern scholars. Ancient documents and archives were also an important source in the study of early Rome. One of the most known collection of texts is the Annales Maximi, an official chronicle kept by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. The chronicle recorded various events that were important to the Romans, such as military operations, treaties with neighboring peoples, construction of public works, food shortages, establishment of colonies, and eclipses. It is a work that is frequently referred to by Roman scholars, with Cicero claiming that the chronicle went as far back as the foundation of the city. However, many argued that the further back it went, the less enriched it was, and that it also included many fictitious events. Aside from the Annales Maximi, there are mentions of documents from the regal period that were kept in the archives of the city during the period of the Republic. These included texts of laws and treaties, along with building inscriptions. Although these were few in number, they were very important for the study of Rome's past. It is crucial to note that some Roman historians claim that the early documents and archives of Rome were destroyed during the sack of the city by the Gauls in 390 BC. Nevertheless, this is probably only half true, as many buildings such as the Capitol and the Temple of Saturn, in which many important archaic documents were kept, were not sacked or looted. The last and one of the most important sources of the Roman historians were the scholars known as antiquarians. In contrast to the historians and annalists who provided a chronological narrative that mostly focused on political and military events, the antiquarians were not confined to these affairs. They collected, studied, and listed thousands of different documents and texts that had to do with a very wide array of subjects such as religion, agriculture, social customs, language, art, and architecture. They provided an enormous amount of information that was studied by both ancient and modern scholars. Their systematic research on topography is especially useful for today's archaeologists. There were many notable antiquarians, but the most highly regarded was Marcus Terentius Varro. Varro dedicated his life to the study of antiquarianism, and his enormous line of work consisted of 490 books. More's the pity, only one complete work of his survives today. Nevertheless, Varro is regarded as one of the most important intellectuals in Roman history, as he is quoted in hundreds of scholarly works and was frequently praised by Roman rhetoricians and senators. Despite the fact that the antiquarians' works were studied by early historians, many later scholars did not use them as a source, although they did study the early Roman historians, who themselves made good use of the antiquarian sources. Before we begin with the story of the Roman kingdom as it was told by Rome's historians, we need to consider a few things. Firstly, as we mentioned, the scholars frequently contradicted each other, even when they studied the same sources. This is because they often added speeches, created new characters, and altered the way certain events took place in order to enrich the story or address a contemporary social or political issue. Nevertheless, as we mentioned, a large part of their work is based on real events. Aside from the historical significance, the account of the Roman kingdom is also important because it reveals what the Romans believed about their ancient past. For this reason, we will focus on the story of Livy, as his work was the most familiar to the Romans. However, information from other scholars will also be included. When Troy was sacked and burned by the Greeks, Aeneas, a member of the Trojan royal family, fled the city along with his father and a large group of his people. Together they sailed the Mediterranean until they reached the area of Laurentum on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. This land belonged to a people called Aborigines, who according to legend were the earliest inhabitants of central Italy. The Trojans, having completely run out of provisions, started raiding and plundering the nearby settlements. As a result, the king of the Aborigines, a man called Latinus, assembled an army and marched to confront the invaders. After the army met with the Trojans on the field, the Aborigines lost the battle and were consequently forced to make peace with the Trojans. According to a different version, before a battle could take place, Latinus met with Aeneas, who told him who he was and where he came from. Latinus was astonished by the tale of Aeneas and his people and decided not to engage in battle, but rather make an alliance with the Trojans. Whether or not a battle took place, the Trojans were now free to settle on these new lands, and Latinus gave Aeneas his daughter Lavinia in marriage as a sign of goodwill and in order to strengthen their alliance. The Trojans then built a new city which they called Lavinium after Aeneas' wife. Not long after, Ascanius, the son of Aeneas and Lavinia, was born. Yet there was no time for peace, as Turnus, the king of the Rutulians, a people who lived further south, was furious with Latinus. Turnus claimed that he was the one that was supposed to marry Lavinia and that her marriage to Aeneas was a cause for war. Thus he assembled an army and attacked both the Trojans and the Aborigines. The Rutulians were defeated, but Latinus was killed in the battle. After the Rutulians realized that they could never beat their enemies on their own, they turned to Mezentius, king of the Etruscans, for help. Mezentius gladly accepted, since the Etruscans viewed the coming of the Trojans and the founding of Lavinium as a major threat to their power in the region. In order to further unite the Trojans and the Aborigines, Aeneas proclaimed that henceforth they would be one and the same people, and they would be called Latins after King Latinus. United as one, the Latins defeated the large army of their enemies, but their leader Aeneas was killed in battle. Aeneas was later deified and was referred to as Pater Indiges. Ascanius was still a child when his father was killed, so his mother Lavinia ruled in his stead. When he came of age, he left the now wealthy city of Lavinium to the care of his mother and established a new city in the east, which he called Alba Longa. The new city would become the main settlement of the Latin people. After 12 generations of kings, trouble was brewing in the kingdom of the Latins. King Procre died and left his kingdom to his eldest son, Numitor. Amulius, the youngest son, was not satisfied with this, and he rebelled and seized the throne by force. He expelled his brother and killed his nephew, while forcing his niece, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal Virgin in order to make sure that no one would challenge his reign. However, Rhea gave birth to twin boys, Romulus and Remus. She claimed that the god Mars was their father, either because she believed it or because she wanted to avoid punishment for breaking her oath. Amulius was furious. He imprisoned Rhea and ordered his soldiers to throw the twins in the river. When a she-wolf descended from the mountains to drink from the river, she found the abandoned twins and nursed them, saving them from starvation. They were later found by a shepherd who took pity on them and brought them to his home, where he and his wife raised them. Many years later, when the twins had grown up, they formed a small group of young men and roamed the forests, either hunting animals or attacking robbers, seizing their loot and distributing it among the shepherds of the village. One day, a group of brigands, furious that the twins had stolen their plunder, decided to ambush them. Romulus managed to escape, but Remus was captured and brought in front of King Amulius. He and his brother were falsely accused of raiding and plundering the lands that belonged to Numitor, who after being expelled by his brother was given an estate near Alba Longa. As a result, Remus was sent to Numitor to receive punishment. The shepherd that raised the twins always knew that they were of royal blood, and at that moment he decided to reveal the truth to Romulus. The news about the royal twins quickly spread throughout the kingdom, and when Numitor realized that the man who was sent to him was actually his grandson, he rejoiced and freed him from any punishment. Thus, an alliance was forged between Numitor, Remus and Romulus, and they attacked the city of Alba Longa together with Numitor's men and the shepherds of the village. Upon seizing the city and killing Amulius, the brothers held an assembly in the city in which they declared their grandfather as the new king. With Numitor now at the throne, the twins set forth to build a new city of their own, near the place where they were found by the she-wolf. Soon after though, a quarrel broke out between them as they argued over who would rule the new city. Finally, they agreed to let the gods decide, so they turned to augury, which is the interpretation of omens by observing the behavior of birds. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill as his stand for the observation, while Remus chose the Aventine Hill. The first omen came to Remus, with 6 vultures flying over the Aventine Hill. Soon after came another omen, this time to Romulus, with 12 vultures flying over the Palatine Hill. When the twins met again, Remus claimed that he was the victor due to the priority of time, while Romulus claimed victory due to the number of the birds. After a heated argument, Romulus killed his brother and claimed the new land as his own. Thus, when the city was built, it was named Rome after its founder. After Romulus fortified the Palatine Hill, he summoned his people and gave them a code of laws. He adopted the kingly appearance and surrounded himself with 12 attendants called lictors. In order to boost the city's population, Romulus offered a sanctuary to anyone who was in search of a new home. Soon after, Rome was flooded by people from neighboring cities, free men and servants alike, who were seeking a better future. After the population increased, Romulus formed a new assembly called the Senate, which was comprised of 100 men called the Fathers, and their descendants would be known as the Patricians. At that point though, the population of Rome consisted solely of men, so the senators decided to send embassies to the neighboring cities in order to find brides for the young men of Rome. However, every single embassy was rejected, and when the Romans realized the position they were in, they devised a nefarious plan. Romulus organized a grand religious festival and invited all the neighboring peoples. These included the people from the cities of Caenina, Crustumerium and Antemne, along with the Romans' northern neighbors, the Sabines, who came to the festival along with their women and children. During the celebrations, the Romans kidnapped and forcefully married a great number of the Sabine women. This naturally enraged the guests, who furiously stormed out of the city as the Romans had violated the laws of hospitality. Then, one by one, the 3 neighboring cities attacked the Romans, but they were defeated and were subsequently put under Roman rule. The inhabitants of these cities were soon after assimilated as Roman citizens. The Sabines were the last to attack the Romans. Tatius, the king of the Sabines, along with his army, stormed and occupied the great citadel of Rome after a local had been bribed to open the gates for them. The next day, the Romans attacked the Sabines and a great battle ensued. In the midst of the conflict, the Sabine women who had been kidnapped by the Romans stood between the Sabine and the Roman army and begged them both to end this fight, for if the battle continued, they would become both fatherless and widowed. The soldiers and their leaders were moved by this act of courage and made peace between them. It was then decided that the Romans and the Sabines would merge and be part of one state, of which Rome would be the capital, and its rulers would be both King Romulus and King Tatius. Many years later, King Tatius was assassinated during a visit to the city of Lavinium, making Romulus the sole ruler of the state. Not long after, the Etruscan city of Veii attacked Rome, raiding and plundering its countryside. The Romans assembled an army and managed to crush the invaders. The city of Veii was so humbled by this defeat that they issued for a 100-year peace with Rome. After the war with Veii, Romulus held an assembly of the Senate and the people. When he was giving a speech, a sudden storm of rain and lightning issued, enveloping the whole place in a thick fog. When the weather cleared up, Romulus was nowhere to be found. The senators that were closer to him claimed that he was embraced and carried away by the storm. The Romans fell in deep sorrow and deified Romulus so that he would be worshipped as the founder of the city. Livy also offers another, less mythological interpretation, that Romulus was actually murdered by the senators closest to him who wanted to claim his power and share it between themselves. Following the death of Romulus, the Senate took hold of the power and decided that each of the 100 senators would rule with the authority of a king for 5 days. And so it happened, as each senator took his turn and ruled the state. This form of government was later called interregnum. After nearly a year, the people started to protest. They argued that they were now ruled by 100 kings instead of one, and that this made the state much weaker than before. Thus, they demanded the power to elect a new king. The Senate complied, but only if they approved of the man that the people would choose. Most of the Romans believed that the new king should be of Roman blood, but the Sabines argued that it was time for one of their own to rule, as Romulus was a single ruler of the state for many years, in which time they had not been represented in power. After a long discussion, a man named Numa Pompilius was proposed. Numa was a Sabine from the city of Corus, who was well known for his intelligence and piety, and was respected by both the Sabines and the Romans. Therefore, the people unanimously elected Numa as their new king with the Senate's approval. When Numa ascended the throne, he immediately began making changes. Numa believed that the Romans were too wild and warlike as a people, and so he needed to find a way to turn them into functional citizens. He realized that this could only be achieved if the Romans feared the gods and became pious, and so he decided to implement new religious institutions. But first he had to pacify Rome, so he proceeded to make peace and forge alliance pacts with all the neighboring cities. Then he erected a temple to Janus, the god of duality, beginnings and endings. Numa declared that when Rome was at war, the gates of the temple would remain open, but in times of peace, the gates would be closed. After that, Numa sought to introduce the new religious institutions, but the Romans were still not ready to conform to these changes, so he pretended to hold conversations with the gods at night and told the Romans that it was the gods who commanded these changes to be made. After convincing his citizens, he appointed priests for each of the gods that were called flamens, the most important of whom were the priests of Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus. He then introduced the College of the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses who maintained the sacred fire that burned in the center of the Temple of Vesta. Numa was also the one who established the position of the Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus was essentially the high priest of Rome, who was in charge of all the major religious institutions, rites, and events. A great feat that is attributed to Numa is the creation of a lunar calendar, which divided the year to 12 months and contained 355 days. This calendar was kept in use, although developed over time, until the adoption of the Julian calendar in 45 BC. The institutions introduced by Numa changed the Romans' way of life, who now feared and respected both the gods and the laws of the state. So much so that even Rome's neighbors started admiring this newfound piety. After reigning for 43 years, King Numa passed away of old age. After his death, an interregnum was once again established, and a year later, a Roman named Tullus Hostilius was chosen by the people in the Senate as the new king. Tullus was an ambitious and a warlike man, and he believed that all these years of peace had made Rome weak. Immediately after his ascendance to the throne, Tullus declared war on Alba Longa due to a quarrel that had broken out between some Roman and Alban farmers. When the opposing armies met, the two leaders decided to discuss things over. Mettus, leader of the Albans, argued that there was no point of a war between Rome and Alba, as it would weaken both cities and give the chance to the neighboring Etruscans to invade. He therefore proposed to Tullus that in order for them to sort things out, there should be a duel between their best warriors, and the city of the winners would claim the territory of the opponent. Both sides chose 3 brothers who happened to be triplets as their best warriors. The Romans emerged victorious from the duel, and thus the city of Alba passed under Roman rule. But Mettus and the people of Alba would gradually become discontent over what had occurred. Not long after, the city of Fidenae revolted against Rome, with the city of Veii coming to its aid. King Tullus mastered the men and rode to war, calling upon the Albans to aid him in the fight. However, when the two opposing armies met on the field, the Albans did not fight as they were ordered. They fled to the mountains and waited to see which side was more likely to win in order to join it at the last moment. When Tullus realized that he was being betrayed, he falsely claimed that the Albans were stationed in the mountains by his command in order to ambush their enemies from the rear. When the enemy soldiers heard of this, they panicked and started to flee, with the Romans chasing after them, killing those that were left behind. When the battle was over, Mettus and his army came down from the mountains and congratulated Tullus on his victory. The next day, Tullus called for both the Romans and the Albans to hold a meeting. He summoned the Albans first, and as soon as they arrived, they were surrounded by Roman legions. Then Tullus gave a speech in which he revealed to the Romans that Mettus did not go to the mountains because he was ordered to do so, but because he was willing to betray the Romans. Tullus then told the Alban soldiers that he did not blame them for their leader's treachery. He then proclaimed that the people of Alba would be relocated to Rome in order to double the city's population, and that he would admit their elders in the Senate in order for Rome and Alba to become one state. Tullus then brutally executed Mettus before everyone and sent forth the Roman cavalry to destroy the city of Alba. Upon entering the city, the Romans ordered the inhabitants to flee to Rome, an order which the people begrudgingly complied to. The Romans then demolished all of the city's buildings except for the temples. As a result, Rome's population doubled and its territory was extended. King Tullus, after admitting the Alban elders to the Senate, built a Senate house which was named Curia Hostilia after himself. Many years later, a pestilence struck Rome, and Tullus himself fell ill with the disease, which made him very weak in both body and mind. He believed that the pestilence was brought upon Rome because he had neglected the gods. As he was not well aware of the Roman religious ways, he fell victim to superstitions that clouded his mind. When Tullus clumsily tried to perform a highly sacred rite, he was struck down by Jupiter because of the impropriety of the ceremony. Thus died Tullus Hostilius after reigning for 32 years. In the aftermath, an interregnum was established once again until a new king was elected. His name was Ancus Marcius, and he was the grandson of King Numa. When Ancus ascended to the throne, he re-established the neglected religious rites that his grandfather had introduced. Although he wanted to rule in a similar way, the times were now different and peace could not be maintained between Rome and its neighbors. Just like Numa had applied religious rites in times of peace, he would be the one to apply the religious rites in times of war. After a quarrel with the Latin cities to their south, the Romans declared war and Ancus marched at the head of the army. He conquered the cities of Politorium, Taleni, Ficana, and Medulia and relocated their people to Rome. After the population was boosted, crime began to rise, and so Ancus decided to build a large prison in the center of the city in order to deter any criminal behavior. He then went to war against the city of Veii and extended Rome's territory, which after the war spread as far as the sea. After this expansion, he built a colony in the new lands, which he called Ostia. During that time, a rich and powerful man called Lucumo came to Rome together with his wife Tanaquil after leaving the Etruscan city of Tarquinia. Lucumo had long since planned to move to Rome, as despite his wealth and social skills, he was not permitted to have any share in Tarquinia's government. This was because he wasn't considered an Etruscan citizen, as his father was a Greek from the city of Corinth. When Lucumo established himself in Rome, he changed his name to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. He then gifted a great part of his wealth to cover the needs of the Roman citizens, and he also frequently invited many senators and other members of the Roman elite to his home. Soon, the king himself summoned Tarquinius to his court, and when he witnessed his intelligence and civility, he invited him to attend all the important events of the city, and later appointed him as the guardian of his children. A few years later, King Angus died, having reigned for 24 years. Following the king's death, Tarquinius sent Angus' sons for a hunt outside the city and immediately called for an assembly in order to elect a new king. There, he proposed himself as a candidate and gave a great speech in order to convince the Romans that if they were to choose him, he would serve the city well. As a result, the Roman people elected him with the approval of the Senate. Tarquinius' first act as king was to incorporate 100 new elders in the Senate in order to gain more influence. Soon after, Tarquin led the Romans to war with the Latins, and after having taken the town of Archaeological, he hosted the first military triumph in Rome. He then commenced the construction of the Circus Maximus, in which the Romans would watch equestrian and boxing games. Not long after, the Sabines rebelled against the Romans, and a great war ensued, with many casualties on both sides. Nevertheless, the Romans eventually managed to subdue the Sabines. A war then once again erupted, this time between the Romans and the Latins, but after Tarquin had conquered a large number of cities, the Latins sued for peace. When he returned to Rome, Tarquin, wishing to honor Jupiter for his victory, leveled an area in the Capitoline Hill in order to build the foundations of a great temple. During that time, an odd incident took place in the palace. A boy named Servius Tullius, who was in the service of the palace, was sleeping when suddenly a ring of fire appeared above his head. However, the fire did not seem to hurt him at all, and the flame disappeared when he woke up. When the royal family heard of what happened, they took it as a sign of divine favor. There are many different theories about Servius' origins. Originally, he was known to be a servant in the palace. However, later Roman historians argued that he was actually of royal blood, but his mother was captured and enslaved by the Romans during a war. Whatever his origins were, according to Livy, after the sign was sent by the gods, King Tarquin treated Servius as his own son and taught him the ways of the palace. Servius turned out to be a capable and intelligent man, so much so that Tarquin decided that he would give him his daughter in marriage. By that time, it was clear that Tarquin intended for Servius to be his successor, but that did not sit well for some people, particularly the sons of the late king, Ancus Marcius. They already resented Tarquin due to the fact that he sent him away when he was going to be elected king. But now their hate was once again fueled when they heard that the next king is going to be a foreigner and a former servant. They believed that they themselves were much more suitable for the throne since they were of Roman royal blood, and so the two brothers began to plot against the king. They hired 2 shepherds to assassinate him and promised to reward them with great gifts if they succeeded. The shepherds then went to the palace and pretended that they were at odds with one another over disputed land. They asked for an audience with the king, as only he could pass fair judgment. King Tarquin arrived and sat on the throne. While one of the shepherds was talking to him, the other one suddenly rushed forward and struck him with an axe. An uproar ensued, but the lictors managed to capture both shepherds. When Tanaquil saw her husband covered in blood, she took him to the royal chambers and summoned Servius. She told Servius that Tarquin was dying and that he should seize the throne immediately to prevent those who sent the assassins to claim it for themselves. Meanwhile, a large crowd had gathered around the palace after hearing about the attack against the king. Tanaquil, addressing the crowd from the windows of the royal chamber, lied to the people by saying that the king was going to be alright and that his wounds were healing. She also announced that Servius would act as king in Tarquin's place until he regained his strength. A few days later, Tarquin was declared dead, and Servius, with the help of his guards and the support of the Senate, became the new king. He was the first ruler of Rome who was not elected by its people. The sons of Ancus who had orchestrated the assassination fled the city and remained in exile for all their lives. The first act of Servius as a king was to arrange a marriage between his daughters and the sons of Tarquin so that they would not feel excluded from the royal family like the sons of King Ancus. After settling that matter, he quickly assembled the army and declared war on Veii and other Etruscan cities. Ultimately, he managed to defeat them in battle, which earned him the unofficial approval of the Roman people. This would be the sole military act of King Servius, as when he returned to Rome, he decided to occupy himself with the matters of the city and the state. He organized the first census of Rome, in which the personal data of every man, woman, and child was recorded. This was done in order for the state to work more efficiently, as after the census, Roman citizens could be appointed tasks that were suitable for them according to their wealth and profession. When the census was completed, King Servius began a great architectural project, expanding the city, granting new land to the people, and later surrounding the city with a great wall, around which a moat was dug. When the fortifications were built, he ordered the construction of a great temple upon the Aventine Hill, dedicated to the goddess Diana. Meanwhile, one of Tarquin's sons and Servius's son-in-law, Tarquinius Superbus or Tarquin the Proud, was beginning to covet the throne. Filled with ambition, he tried to undermine the authority of the king and began talking about him to senators and commoners alike, pointing out the fact that his rule was illegitimate as he was not lawfully elected by the people. When the king heard about these talks, he summoned an assembly and asked the people whether they approve of him or not. Then, according to Livy, Servius was declared king with such unanimity as had not been observed in the election of any of his predecessors. Yet this did not deter Tarquin, for his ambition was strong, and he knew that despite the fact that Servius was loved by the people, most of the senators did not think highly of him because of his institution of laws that had decreased the power of the Senate. As we have previously mentioned, Tarquin and his brother were married to the two daughters of Servius, yet Tarquin and his brother's wife Tullia were much more alike than their respective spouses, as they were both extremely power-hungry. So in order for these two to be together and achieve their wicked ambitions, they murdered their siblings and subsequently got married. Years later, when Servius had grown old, Tarquin devised a plot to overthrow him. He began offering great gifts to the senators and promised to give them more power if they helped him overthrow the king. When he earned the loyalty of many senators, Tarquin decided that it was time to act, and so, accompanied by a group of armed men, he stormed the Senate house, sat upon the king's throne, and ordered the senators to assemble before him. When the senators gathered, a great commotion began. Many of them already knew about the plot, but others were stunned and did not know what to make of the situation. Tarquin then gave a speech, talking about how he had the right to be king and that Servius was a servant who stole the throne from his father without the legal procedures. When he finished his speech, Servius furiously stormed inside the palace and demanded to know what was the meaning of this action. After a brief quarrel between King Servius and Tarquin, a fight broke out between their supporters. In the midst of the fight, Tarquin grabbed Servius, dragged him outside the building, and threw him down the stairs. The king, although badly wounded, survived the fall and tried to reach his home, but he was murdered by two assassins sent by Tarquin or Tullia, his daughter. When Tarquin entered the Senate house again, Servius's men fled and he was proclaimed king by whatever portion of the Senate was still present. When Tarquin took the throne, he immediately executed the senators that were loyal to the late king. He surrounded himself with an armed guard that protected him at all times and took all legal matters unto himself, abolishing the power of the Senate and the People's Assembly. With his power now unchecked, he ruled with an iron fist, prosecuting, banishing and executing a great number of people. After he established himself as the absolute ruler of Rome, Tarquin formed an alliance with the Latin cities through the means of fear and manipulation. The Romans and the Latins then attacked the Volsci tribe in the south, sacking and plundering their cities. When Tarquin returned to Rome victorious, he used the spoils of war to fund the construction of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the foundations of which had been laid by his father, Priscus. Tarquin then turned his attention outwards and declared war on the Latin city of Gabii. The Romans fought hard, but they were ultimately repulsed from the city. That did not sit well with Tarquin, so he devised a plan to conquer the city through an unconventional way. He sent one of his sons, Sextus, who after arriving at Gabii claimed that he was fleeing from Rome in fear because his father had grown so violent and tyrannical that even his own family despised him. The Gabians, believing that Sextus would be a great asset against their war with Rome due to his knowledge of the city and the royal family, allowed him to stay. Gradually, Sextus climbed the ranks of the city's hierarchy and was admitted to attend the Council of the Elders. In order to make the Gabians trust him completely, he joined their army and fought in many battles. Through these achievements, Sextus earned the position of High General and also gained control over the city's council. When he finally acquired so much power and influence over the people of Gabii, his father commanded him to execute Order 66. Sextus proceeded to kill all the prominent men of the city, accusing them of treason. Some were executed publicly, while others were assassinated. After having dealt with the ruling class, Sextus banished a large number of the common people and distributed their wealth. Finally, he opened the gates to the Roman army, who took the city without any form of resistance. According to Livy, this was the one and only time that the Romans conquered the city through mischievous ways. When Gabii was conquered, Tarquin finally turned his attention to Rome. He put to work an overwhelming number of Romans in order to build the great temple of Jupiter and an enormous complex sewage system. Although these works were remarkable, they exhausted the Roman citizens and drained the state's treasury. Tarquin realized that, and wishing to gather plunder, he declared war upon the city of Ardea, a place of great riches. When the Romans attacked the city's walls, they were repelled, so they set up camp outside of the city to prepare for the next assault. During a meal in the camp, there was an argument between the members of the royal family, particularly between Sextus, the king's son, and Collatinus Tarquinius, the king's cousin. They argued over whose wife was more righteous, pious, and reserved. After many cups of wine, they decided to visit their homes and see for themselves whose wife was more virtuous. So they mounted their horses and rode away from the camp. After passing by Rome and seeing the prince's wives, who were spending time doing luxurious activities, they went to the city of Calatia, where they found Collatinus's wife, Lucretia, weaving wool in the company of her maids. The men then agreed that Lucretia was the most virtuous of all their wives, and Collatinus, being content with his victory, invited them to stay the night at his house. Unbeknownst to him, Sextus, after seeing Lucretia, was overcome with lust. A few days later, without the knowledge of Collatinus, Sextus visited the house of Lucretia, who invited him to eat and stay for the night. While she was sleeping, Sextus stormed into Lucretia's room and sexually abused her, threatening to kill her if she resisted. After committing this vile crime, Sextus left the city and returned to the camp. Lucretia then immediately sent for her father and her husband and told them both to bring one trusted friend with them. Her father came with Publius Valerius and her husband came with Lucius Brutus. Brutus was the king's nephew, but he deeply despised him because of his tyrannical rule and because he had executed his brother with the pretense that he was conspiring against him. When the men arrived, Lucretia told them what had happened while sobbing uncontrollably. Then, when her family tried to console her, she pulled out a knife and stabbed herself, subsequently falling dead on the floor. The men cried aloud in shock and disbelief. While the others were overwhelmed with grief, Brutus picked up Lucretia's knife and swore upon it to overthrow the king. The others swore the same oath and then proclaimed Brutus as their leader. Then they went to the central temple of Calatia and informed the people of what had happened. Many men, furious by what they heard, readily joined their cause, and after a while they left Calatia and headed to Rome. When the men arrived in Rome, armed and ready, they entered the forum, where Brutus gave a great speech to the Roman people. He spoke about Sextus's vile crime against Lucretia, the wickedness of the king and the violent nature of his rule, as well as his unlawfulness, which was unheard of up until his time. The Roman people, who already despised their king, were glad to hear such a speech and vowed to join Brutus's cause. Subsequently, they took control of the city and banished the royal family from Rome. When King Tarquin heard of what had happened, he left the army camp and rode to the city. Brutus then left Rome after being informed that the king was on his way there, and he went to the camp by a different road to gain the favor of the soldiers and turn them against the king. When Tarquin reached Rome, its gates were closed and the people informed him of his banishment. Having lost the support of the army, Tarquin fled to the Etruscan city of Caere. His son Sextus went to the city of Gabii and was murdered a few days later on the city's streets. After 244 years, the reign of the kings came to an end with the banishment of Tarquin the Proud and with the election of the first consuls, Lucius Tarquinius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, and thus the Roman Republic was born. At the beginning of the Iron Age, around 900 BC, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of various tribes. One of these were the Latins, who inhabited a large part of central Italy. They had established various settlements, including those at the site which would be later known as Rome. This area was famous for its 7 easily defensible hills and provided a good supply of fresh water along with access to the sea through the river Tiber. The main settlements were established on the Palatine, the Capitoline and Quirinal hills. They were fairly small in the beginning and only numbered to a total of 100 people with no indication of an established hierarchy. There aren't many archaeological findings from this period, but we do know that the people of those settlements resided in wattle and daub huts, and they mainly lived off the land, cultivating wheat, barley and peas, while also raising livestock such as pigs and sheep. Most of the findings though come from the cemeteries. During this period, the funerary rites included both cremation and inhumation. Funerary urns, along with votive deposits, personal ornaments and grave furniture were all found in the cemeteries of that period. From 870 BC onwards, things began to change. Many new settlements were established in Rome and all around Latium, while some of the old ones like Alba Longa started to decline. In the region of Rome, the population of the settlements largely increased, and the community of the Palatine Hill merged with the one on the Capitoline Hill. Between them stood an area which would be later known as the Forum. In the early years, a large part of the Forum was often flooded due to the overflowing of the Tiber, yet the newfound community started building huts in that area near to the cemetery which they shared. Regarding the cemetery, the findings seem to indicate that during that period, inhumation had become the only funerary rite practiced in the region. During the early 8th century BC, the union of the two settlements began to expand and slowly started to integrate the rest of the nearby settlements. The inhabitants of the region started paving a large part of the Forum and seized the use of the Forum cemetery, continuing the burials near the Esquiline Hill. This probably happened because the Forum was declared as a public space for the community and was now used as a market and a civic center. This is a significant development, as until then, the settlements were a large concentration of huts with no signs of formal planning of space. Many more changes would come around the mid-8th century BC as the merging between the two settlements would be complete. Upon the Palatine Hill, traces of what is believed to be a ceremonial wall were found, as well as very large huts with distinct architectural features. One of these huts is believed to have been a proto-temple, and another was probably used as a residence for the local leader. These new structures, as well as a great number of intricate items found in some of the period's graves, point to the development of a distinct hierarchy. There was also a development in agriculture as the Romans started cultivating olive trees and vines in the surrounding countryside. Another development of the mid-8th century BC was the introduction of wheel-made pottery, which gradually replaced the previously dominant handmade pottery. With the increasing specialization of labor and the rise of craftsmanship, the first signs of trade with different cultures appeared in Rome. It was around that time that the Greeks and the Phoenicians, having established colonies in the Italian peninsula and the island of Sicily, came in contact with the Romans. This can be confirmed by the Greek ceramics and Phoenician wine vases that were found in the region of Rome. Vases of Buccara pottery have also been found, indicating that the Romans traded with the neighboring Etruscan cities. All these contacts would make a significant impact on the culture of early Rome. Around the end of the 8th century BC began what is known as the Orientalizing period, which would last until the beginning of the 6th century BC. This period is characterized by the increasing influence of the Eastern Mediterranean peoples like the Greeks, the Phoenicians and the Egyptians on the cultures of the Italian peninsula. The Romans were especially influenced by the Greeks and the Etruscans, who were themselves largely influenced by both the Phoenicians and the Greeks. This cultural interaction had a great impact on many aspects of the Roman culture, such as religion, politics, writing, pottery and architecture. The distinction between the common people and the elite steadily became more visible. Several tombs dating to the beginning of the 7th century BC contained a large amount of items that were used as symbols of wealth and power. Among these were chariots, gold and amber jewelry, large bronze vessels, and ceramics imported from the Eastern Mediterranean. Along with these graves, chamber tombs began to be constructed, which were specifically made as burial places for the members of elite families. These findings suggest that there was a rise of powerful clans in the region. The first traces of large-scale urbanization in the region of Rome date to around mid-7th century BC or possibly a bit earlier. These include the first houses and public buildings made of stone and roof tiles, as well as the increasingly formal planning of the settlement. Another remarkable change was the demolition of the huts in the Forum and the pavement of a rough beaten floor around the region. Some years later, the pavement was renewed and was extended to the northwest. During the late 7th century BC, two public buildings were constructed in the Forum. The traces of the first building were found in the eastern side of the Forum. This structure is the Regia. In Republican times it was a religious building, but during the regal period it was probably part of the royal residence. The traces of the second public building were found on the northern side of the Forum in the area of the Comitium. The building is believed to be the Curia Hostilia, the first house of the Roman Senate. Despite the construction of these buildings, wattle and daub huts would continue to be built, although they would steadily give way to stone houses. The latest huts found in Rome date to the early 6th century BC. During the period between the early and late 6th century BC, Rome would become a full-fledged city-state. Recent excavations in the Forum Boarium have revealed what is believed to be the first stone-built temple in Rome. The building is situated on the lowest crossing point of the Tiber and dates back to 580 BC. It was probably dedicated to the Roman goddess Mater Matuta. There are two intriguing facts about the specific temple. The first is that the stones with which the temple was built were imported from a faraway region, and the second is that archaeologists have discovered fascinating works of art, such as terracotta friezes and statues of Minerva and Hercules. Around the same time, a large building which is believed to have been a sanctuary was constructed south of the Senate House. Excavations have revealed a small statue, 3 monumentalized springs, and a large block of stone engraved with an archaic Latin inscription. The text as it is now is incomplete, but we do know that it contains the words king and assembly. Included in the interesting findings are the traces of fortifications that date back to the 6th century BC. Each hill had probably already been equipped with its own small-scale wall, but it was during that time that the outer fortifications of Rome were built. These were made out of large stones of tuff, which is a rock formed by the consolidation of volcanic ash. In certain spots, the wall was supplemented by huge earthworks. It is impossible to know if the walls formed a complete circuit around the city at that time, as they were nearly completely replaced with a stronger and larger line of walls during the early 4th century BC. Arguably, the greatest construction of that time was the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which dates back to the end of the 6th century BC. It was the largest temple in central Italy and one of the largest in the Mediterranean at that time. Today, only a small part of the foundation survives, but its size confirms that the temple was indeed huge. In general, throughout the 6th century BC, the Romans built a great number of temples. According to archaeologists, at the end of the 6th century, Rome had 14 temples, more than probably any other city-state in Europe. During the 6th century, the Romans also started constructing freshwater canals that guided streams through their lines in order to drain the marshes and muddy areas of Rome. At the same time, on the northern slopes of the Palatine, a large area was leveled and reorganized, upon which the Romans built rows of private residences for the members of the elite families. This points to the growing power of the senators during that period. Finally, archaeologists have discovered that around 500 BC, a widespread destruction occurred in Rome, and areas such as the Comitium, the Regia, and the Temple of Martyr Matuta were destroyed or burnt down. Despite this, most of the destroyed buildings were quickly rebuilt afterwards. We have seen the most significant archaeological findings of the regal period, which according to the literary sources began around the mid-8th century BC and ended in the late 6th century BC. We could leave it at that and be content with these findings on their own, but we will try to make sense of the Roman scholarly work by examining these findings. But one ought to be cautious and should not rush to conclusions when trying to connect excavation findings with stories and legends. And with that in mind, let's do a quick review of the literary stories and archaeological findings in a chronological order. We will begin with Aeneas and the origins of Rome. From what we have seen, it is safe to assume that Aeneas as a historical figure most probably never existed. The story of the Trojan War influenced a lot of different cultures, and the prophecy that one day Aeneas and his family would rule Troy once again fueled the imagination of many. Since the site of Troy was abandoned for centuries, people began to speculate that Aeneas must have established his dynasty somewhere else, and before long, several cities were claiming Aeneas as their founder. The first mention of Aeneas in relation to Rome and central Italy came from Greek historians who lived during the 5th century BC. These scholars either wanted to connect Greek mythology with the people of central Italy, as Greeks often like to do with foreign cultures, or they simply stated what the Romans themselves believed at that time. In the following centuries, many Roman historians, antiquarians and poets would write about the journey of Aeneas to central Italy, with the Aeneid, the epic poem written by Virgil, being the most famous of these works. It is almost certain that the story of Aeneas was added later to the established legend of Romulus, since in earlier times Aeneas was thought to be the father of Romulus. Yet when the Romans studied the chronology and realized that there was a gap of 4 centuries between the two men, they needed to find another way to connect them, so they presumably invented the legend of the Alban kings. We can safely assume that this part of the story is probably a myth, as there is no archaeological proof of any established hierarchy in the region of Latium before the 8th century BC. The only archaeological finding in central Italy that is loosely connected to Aeneas is found in the city of Lavinium, the founder of which was Aeneas according to the legend. There, archaeologists excavated a sanctuary which was first established during the late Archaic period. It was a place of pilgrimage for all the Latin people, and it is said that even the Roman emperors attended the celebrations that occurred there yearly. The sanctuary was dedicated to the Depenentes, the Latin household gods who protected the Roman state. These deities were connected with Aeneas in the Roman mythology. Some ancient scholars claim that inside the sanctuary, the people worshipped a number of mysterious sacred objects that were believed to have been brought from Troy by Aeneas. Aeneas himself was worshipped there as a deified hero with the name of Pater Indiges. Of course, this sanctuary does not confirm the historical existence of Aeneas, but it does confirm that already by the late Archaic period, Aeneas was part of the Roman mythology and religious rites. Now, regarding the tale of Rome's founding, most modern scholars believe that Romulus did not exist as a historical figure. They presume that he was made up to be regarded as the mythical founder of the city, a standard story motif which was mainly used in the legends of the ancient Greek cities. In addition, his name quite literally means the Roman. The main indication though is that according to the tale, Romulus founded the city around the 8th century BC, yet as we have discovered, the site of Rome had been inhabited at least 200 years before that, so the establishment of Rome by Romulus as a completely new settlement doesn't add up. Nevertheless, we saw that there are findings that date to the mid and late 8th century BC, like the small ceremonial wall, the proto-temple hut, and the structure that is believed to be the residence of a chieftain. All of these were found on the Palatine Hill, where Romulus was said to have established the first settlement. This means that Romulus may have been loosely based on a historical figure who established his status as the chieftain of the Palatine Hill and would later incorporate the nearby settlements. This, however, is just a theory. Furthermore, there was a disagreement among the scholars on the state of the settlement during the time of Romulus. While some believe that Romulus established a city-state with surrounding walls and a full legal code, others believe that at that time, Rome was still a small settlement of wattle and daub huts. As we have seen, archaeology mostly confirms the latter opinion. The Romans did not necessarily view the more primitive settlement as a bad thing. In fact, many of the scholars, especially Livy, emphasized on the fact that the Romans were more pure during that time, when they weren't decadent and had not yet developed a lust for gold, power, and luxury. Even in Republican and Imperial times, a lone hut similar to those of the Iron Age stood on the slopes of the Capitoline Hill. It was believed to be the hut of Romulus and was visited by the Romans in order for them to worship the deified hero or to simply look upon the residence of the founder of Rome. The question of what was the state of Rome during the early regal period rose again, but this time among modern scholars. This is because, according to the evidence, Rome really started to be urbanized during the mid-7th century BC. The findings that we mentioned, such as the pavement of the Forum, the demolition of many huts, and the construction of stone buildings, are all signs of that process. A number of archaeologists believe that the official history of Rome thus began in the 7th century BC, as it was then when the city was truly founded, and that if Romulus actually existed, he must have lived around that time as its first king. Others, though, believed that the first 4 kings probably ruled over a more primitive settlement, and it was after the arrival of King Tarquinius Priscus that Rome entered its urbanized stage. Most archaeologists today, though, believe that these arguments are based upon disputable sources, as the list of kings itself cannot possibly be historically accurate. If we take the reign of the kings literally, it means that the 7 successive kings ruled over a period of 244 years. This is nearly impossible even for today's standards, and nothing similar has ever happened in history. The Romans themselves realized that and even made minor changes to the story, like when they made Tarquinius Superbus the grandson of Tarquinius Priscus rather than his son. So the answer to the first argument is that either the reign of the kings started in the mid-7th century BC and so lasted around 120 years instead of 240, or there were actually many more than just 7 kings, and the Romans simplified the story, attributing buildings and institutions founded by many people to only a few for the sake of storytelling. as you can see, trying to connect the archaeological findings with the literary history of the kingdom brings more problems than solutions. Problems that are, at least for now, unsolvable. Continuing with the chronological order, the next important building that bears a connection to the story is the one that is situated in the Comitium. Dating to the 7th century BC, it is believed to be the first Senate house, which according to legend was founded by Tullus Hostilius. This building was found under the ruins of the next two Senate houses, the Curia Cornelia and the Curia Julia. The most prominent and perhaps the most easily identifiable building of the regal period is the Temple of Jupiter Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. According to the legend, it was Tarquinius Priscus that marked the area where the temple was going to be built, and his son or grandson Tarquinius Superbus began its construction. However, the temple's inauguration took place during the first year of the Republic. The base of the building was found at the exact spot the temple was supposed to be according to the literary works and dates roughly to the same period. Finally, perhaps the most interesting finding of all is the traces of destruction by fire of important buildings like the Regia and the Forum Boarium temple. Knowing that the Regia was the residence of the king, this probably indicates that there was a revolt against him at that time. Conveniently, this destruction dates to around 500 BC, which coincides with the revolt against the last king that was mentioned in the works of the Roman historians. It should be noted that there were many buildings and institutions mentioned in the stories of which no archaeological trace has been found. However, that does not necessarily mean that they never existed. Judging by the archaeological findings, it is evident that the history of the Kingdom of Rome, as it was written by the Roman scholars, begins as a fully mythological tale and slowly develops into a historical or at least semi-legendary story. As we mentioned, it is certainly possible that the Romans may have simplified the story that was passed down from their ancestors by attributing the work of many to only a few. It is also possible that some kings were meant to symbolize certain cultural aspects. The fact that Tarquinius Priscus was thought to be half Etruscan and half Greek may symbolize the influence that the Etruscan and Greek cultures had on Rome at that time. The only thing that we can be sure about is that Rome was indeed ruled by kings in its early years. Despite the fact that we cannot be certain about how many kings there were, or if the names that we know were real, many of the institutions and constructions that are attributed to them are real enough. And judging by the state of Rome at the beginning of the 5th century BC, the Roman kings had up until then created a powerful city-state with great temples, public buildings and squares, large fortifications, and an overall very well organized urban space, making Rome greater than most European city-states at that time.